In early April 1945, at Allied headquarters in Europe, Lieutenant General George S. Patton stood with his arms crossed outside the corridor of a closed conference room, faintly catching the murmur of discussion from within. On the map table, the city of Berlin was circled in bright red. Inside, General of the Army, Dwight D. Eisenhower and senior commanders, including Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, were deciding the final move of the war. Patton had not been invited. An aide stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir. This meeting is restricted to selected principal commanders." Patton clenched his fist. Through the frosted glass, he saw Eisenhower leaning toward Montgomery and caught fragments of a sentence. "Berlin will be taken by the Red Army." The meeting that sealed Berlin's fate went on without America's fastest savior. Patton, the general who had delivered some of the most rapid victories in Europe, now stood on the sidelines, excluded from the ultimate decision. The story of how Patton came to this fate began years earlier. Let us turn back the clock to North Africa in 1943, to the blazing battlefield of Tunisia. The U.S. Army had just suffered a bitter defeat at the Kasserine Pass. A new commander was dispatched to restore order within 2nd Corps, Major General George S. Patton. From the moment he arrived, Patton imposed his trademark iron discipline. He demanded that soldiers be clean-shaven, wear their helmets, and keep their ties fastened, even under the searing desert sun. When he saw American troops digging their defensive positions too deeply, Patton erupted in fury. He even urinated into a freshly dug trench to show his contempt for what he saw as passive, defensive thinking. Always attack, never dig in, was the doctrine he imposed on the entire Corps. That ferocious style quickly revived the demoralized Corps. Within weeks, under Patton's iron hand, American soldiers regained their fighting spirit and, alongside their British allies, defeated Axis forces in Tunisia. On the 13th of May, 1943, more than 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered in North Africa, a powerful debut for Patton, proving him to be an effective commander and restoring the honor of the U.S. Army after Kasserine. In the summer of 1943, George S. Patton returned to the European theater as commander of the U.S. 7th Army during Operation Husky, the first large-scale American amphibious landing on European soil on the island of Sicily. On paper, Patton's mission was modest: to hold the left flank and shield the British 8th Army of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery as it advanced head-on from the east. Patton understood the unspoken message behind the order. He had been assigned a supporting role, not the one meant to set the tempo of the campaign, but battlefields do not operate according to paperwork. When Montgomery's spearhead was halted by dense German defenses around Catania, the entire Sicily campaign slid into a dangerous stalemate. Patton perceived what many other commanders missed. The enemy was concentrating its strength in the east, leaving the western part of the island exposed. While Allied headquarters hesitated, Patton made his move. He requested permission from General Alexander to shift the 7th Army from a defensive posture to a mobile offensive. The approval came reluctantly, and Patton immediately turned it into an opportunity. He hurled his forces like a blade sweeping across Sicily's flank. American armored and mechanized infantry units were ordered to advance relentlessly, bypassing minor pockets of resistance and driving straight into the enemy's rear. In less than 72 hours, the 7th Army covered more than 160 kilometers of rugged mountain terrain and captured Palermo, the capital, and the largest logistical hub in western Sicily. The advance unfolded at a pace that stunned friend and foe alike. Patton did more than seize a city. He shattered the entire defensive disposition of German-Italian forces in Sicily, forcing the enemy to divert troops from the Eastern Front to rescue the collapsing western flank. After capturing Palermo on July 21, Patton did not pause. He immediately pivoted. turning his axis of advance northeast toward Messina, the last escape route for German forces out of Sicily. Despite shortages of landing craft and naval transport, Patton repeatedly organized small, audacious, amphibious landings behind enemy lines, severing withdrawal routes and sowing maximum confusion. This was Patton's signature style of warfare. Give the enemy no time to breathe, and deny opposing commanders any opportunity to reorganize. On the 16th of August 1943, American tanks rolled into Messina just hours before Montgomery's British forces arrived. The Germans had managed to evacuate most of their troops across the strait. But the campaign was effectively decided. Patton crossed the finish line first in the unofficial race, with Montgomery a race never written into orders, yet perfectly understood by both men. For Patton, this was not merely a tactical victory, but a blunt declaration that the U.S. Army could move faster, strike deeper, and exploit the battlefield more aggressively than any of its allies. Yet Patton's victory in Sicily did not end in unalloyed glory. It was overshadowed by a scandal that seemed minor on the surface, but struck directly at a boundary the American military-political system could not ignore. During the campaign, Patton visited a field hospital behind the front and encountered two soldiers who bore no physical wounds, only psychological collapse from the strain of war. To Patton, who believed victory flowed solely from iron will, this was a sign of cowardice. In a burst of fury, he slapped them and berated them harshly. That act lasted only a few seconds, but its consequences stretched on for months. The incident quickly reached the highest levels of command. Eisenhower viewed it not as a personal lapse, but as a threat to Army morale and to America's image before the public. Patton was forced to issue a public apology to the entire Corps, an unprecedented humiliation for a general fresh from victory. When the press became involved, the image of old blood and guts was turned on its head. Public outrage followed. Political pressure closed in. Eisenhower had no real choice. Patton was removed from the front line. He was excluded from the Italian campaign, and as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, Patton was kept on ice once again, not because he lacked ability, but because the system no longer considered him a safe card to play. Instead of giving Patton a real army, Eisenhower assigned him a role without precedent, commanding an army that did not exist. In Operation Fortitude, Patton became a strategic decoy. Inflatable tanks, dummy camps, fake radio traffic, and Patton himself, whose reputation terrified the Germans, formed the perfect disguise. The Germans were convinced he would strike at Pas-de-Calais and held their most elite forces there. As a result, when the Allies landed in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, resistance was significantly weaker. It was a bitter paradox. Patton was removed from the battlefield because of who he was, yet he contributed decisively to Europe's greatest victory precisely when he was forbidden to command troops directly. A genius bound in place yet transformed into a strategic weapon by the very system that had sidelined him. After D-Day, once the Allied forces had secured their foothold on the beaches of Normandy, Dwight D. Eisenhower finally decided to unleash his most dangerous sword back onto the battlefield. In August 1944, George S. Patton was given command of the U.S. Third Army, a completely new force, created for a single purpose: to strike fast, drive deep, and shatter the entire German defensive system in Western Europe. Patton did not hesitate for a second. The moment he was released from his chains, he immediately unleashed his signature style of warfare: high-speed maneuver warfare. The armored spearheads of Third Army did not stop to eliminate every pocket of resistance. They plunged straight into the enemy rear, executing repeated envelopments. This was Patton's philosophy of war: keep the enemy engaged at the front, then use speed and firepower to strike where he was weakest behind the lines. German forces, already exhausted after Normandy, rapidly fell into disintegration. Defensive lines that had not yet fully formed were pierced. Headquarters that had just been established were forced to flee. In less than 3 weeks after breaking out of Normandy, Third Army swept nearly 500 kilometers across France. Major cities were liberated at a pace that even Allied headquarters struggled to keep up with on their maps. Some units advanced at a tempo that bordered on the absurd. On the 25th of August 1944, one of Patton's divisions covered nearly 450 kilometers in a single day, an extraordinary record for mechanized movement in modern warfare. Patton had turned France into an open corridor, where American tanks raced ahead faster than orders from headquarters. In that moment, Patton was the most effective offensive commander in Europe. But that very speed exposed a limitation. Patton could not control logistics. His forces advanced so rapidly that they outran their entire supply system. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts still had to be hauled from the Normandy beachheads hundreds of kilometers behind the front, while major ports had yet to reach full operating capacity. By early September 1944, Patton's spearheads were forced to halt near the Meuse River, not because of a German counterattack, but because they had simply run out of fuel. He reported that he needed hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline to continue the advance, yet received only a fraction of that amount. The fastest war machine in Europe was strangled by its own lifeblood. To salvage the situation, the vast logistical system known as the Red Ball Express was activated. Thousands of trucks ran day and night without pause, hauling fuel and ammunition from the coast to the front lines. Many of those drivers were African-American soldiers, quietly ensuring that the wheels of war did not come to a complete stop. Yet no matter the effort, supply could not keep pace with Patton's ambitions. Just short of the gates of Germany, the fastest advance of the war was forced to slow. Patton bitterly remarked that nothing was more terrible than being starved when the feast had already been laid out before one's eyes. This involuntary pause came precisely as Allied leadership entered a fierce strategic debate. Field Marshal Montgomery argued for concentrating all resources on a single northern thrust through the Netherlands. Patton and General Omar Bradley, by contrast, believed the advance should continue across the entire front, exploiting the Germans' collapse. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, faced a decision that was not only military, but also political, and bound up with alliance management. In the end, he chose the safer course. Fuel was prioritized for Montgomery. Patton's momentum was sacrificed. Third Army was ordered into active defense, an instruction that was almost an insult to Patton's relentlessly offensive nature. Watching his fuel stocks diverted to the British, Patton grasped a harsh truth. In Patton's eyes, it was not the Germans who had stopped him, but the Allied system itself. A system that placed caution and political balance above speed and audacity. From that moment on, the conflict between Patton and the High Command was no longer a matter of personality. It became a clash between an operational genius who wanted to end the war as quickly as possible and a system that had to control the war in order to manage the aftermath of victory. This very conflict would follow Patton all the way to the moment he was excluded from the final decisions of the war in Europe. Despite being constrained by orders and shortages of supply, Patton was never the type to sit idle and wait. Even when forced into a defensive posture, he continuously pushed his units forward in small increments under the guise of aggressive reconnaissance. It was Patton's way of testing the system's limits, advancing just far enough to keep pressure on the Germans, but not so far as to give his superiors an excuse to slam on the brakes once again. By October 1944, as supply lines began to improve, Patton immediately resumed offensive operations in the Lorraine region, near the German border. This time, however, he was no longer facing an enemy in full retreat. The Germans had used the precious pause to reorganize, constructing a formidable defensive network around Metz, a fortress city built for 19th-century warfare, yet lethally effective in modern combat. Prolonged autumn rains turned fields into seas of mud, bogging down American tanks, while infantry confronted intense fire from concrete bunkers and underground fortifications. For the first time in the European campaign, Patton's momentum was halted for weeks. He grew furious and irritable. Patton personally went to the front lines, ignoring danger, crawling through trenches to inspect enemy defensive positions. Yet even he could not break Fort Driant, a key stronghold guarding Metz, through sheer will and speed alone. It was not until mid-November that Metz finally fell, and the cost was heavy casualties for Third Army. Patton prevailed, but it was a hollow victory. It exposed an uncomfortable truth. Speed has limits, and audacity, when mistimed, can be paid for in the blood of one's own soldiers. In later years, Patton would call Fort Driant the bitterest failure of his career. While Patton was still bogged down among the gray stone fortresses of Lorraine, history suddenly swerved. In mid-December 1944, German forces launched their final strategic counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest. Waves of German armored divisions smashed through thin American defensive lines, creating a massive bulge more than 100 kilometers deep into Belgian territory. The northern wing of the Allied front reeled. 2 U.S. armies were pushed back, and the specter of a localized collapse loomed unmistakably into view. On December 19, Eisenhower urgently convened his generals at Verdun. Patton entered the conference room with a map already folded and ready. While the other commanders were still analyzing the situation, Patton had already identified the key point. The Germans were staking everything, and if struck on the flank, they would break. Within minutes, he made a pledge that silenced the room. Patton said he could pivot the entire Third Army from the south to the north and counterattack the Germans within 48 hours. It sounded like madness. To move more than 250,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and countless vehicles, in the depths of winter, along ice-covered roads in 2 days. But Patton was not speaking off the cuff. He had sensed the possibility of a German counteroffensive in advance, and had quietly prepared a contingency plan to shift his axis. When Eisenhower nodded, Patton's war machine immediately went into motion. Convoys turned 90 degrees in the night. Tank tracks ground into ice and snow, and columns stretched for dozens of kilometers. Within 2 days, Third Army had marched more than 160 kilometers and appeared precisely where the Germans least expected. On Christmas Eve, the spearhead of the 4th Armored Division broke through the encirclement and drove into Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded for days in the bitter cold, was finally relieved. Patton arrived in Bastogne shortly thereafter, his face flushed red from the cold, his familiar ivory-handled pistol at his side. He walked past soldiers who had narrowly escaped death, then stopped to bow to Brigadier General McAuliffe, a rare gesture that showed Patton understood the price of that endurance. The Battle of the Bulge, from a potential catastrophe, had become Patton's finest moment in the European war. But this victory also laid bare deeper fractures. Throughout the counteroffensive, Eisenhower temporarily placed the northern wing under Montgomery's command, a decision that openly irritated Patton. As the Ardennes pocket began to close, Patton and Montgomery plunged into another unspoken race to see who would reach Houffalize first. Patton won by a narrow margin, and he knew exactly how much that mattered to Monty. Montgomery held press conferences to claim credit. Patton responded with biting sarcasm behind the scenes. Once again, Eisenhower was forced to stand in the middle, keeping the alliance from fracturing under the weight of 2 enormous egos. The Battle of the Bulge confirmed Patton as the Allied commander, with the fastest operational reflexes. At the same time, it reinforced the High Command's unease. Patton was too fast, too independent, and too difficult to control. He could save an entire front within 48 hours, but he could also generate political consequences the system was not prepared to accept. That very paradox would follow Patton to the final days of the war, when victory was within reach, yet decision-making power no longer rested with him. By March 1945, the gates of Germany finally stood open. Allied forces crossed the Rhine en masse, shattering the last natural defensive barrier of the Third Reich. And as always, Patton refused to come second to anyone. While other headquarters were still preparing elaborate river-crossing operations, Patton chose his familiar path. Strike first, ask later. On the night of the 22nd of March 1945, under cover of darkness near the town of Oppenheim, Patton quietly ordered his engineers to throw pontoon bridges across the Rhine. There was no thunderous preparatory barrage, no massive air support, no airborne drops behind enemy lines, only speed, surprise, and calculated audacity. German forces were caught completely off guard. By dawn, the first units of Third Army were firmly established on the east bank of the Rhine 2 days ahead of Montgomery. The following morning, Patton could barely conceal his delight. He phoned General Bradley in an excited voice, urging secrecy. His troops were already across the river, and the enemy had scarcely realized what was happening. But by evening, when German artillery began to fire back, Patton abruptly changed tone. He called again, demanding that the news be released immediately. Patton wanted one thing made absolutely clear. Third Army had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery. The news spread like wildfire. The press hailed Patton for crossing Germany's symbolic river without theatrical display. It was a blow aimed not only at the Germans, but also a public taunt directed at Montgomery, who was preparing a grand Rhine crossing with Prime Minister Churchill in attendance. Anglo-American rivalry reached its peak, even as it signaled the end. By this point, the Third Reich no longer had the capacity to save itself. In April 1945, Patton's Third Army surged across southern Germany like a flood. Advance units liberated concentration camps, exposing American soldiers to the true face of the Nazi regime. Patton witnessed these scenes firsthand and was deeply shaken. A man long accustomed to the blood and violence of the battlefield, he now felt nauseated and fell silent before the scale of systematic brutality. At the same time, his troops uncovered vast caches of Nazi gold hidden in mines, evidence of how the German war machine had looted an entire continent. Militarily, Patton was at the height of his power. His deep thrusts crossed the Elbe at multiple points, leaving him less than 100 miles from Berlin. In Patton's mind, the war was not yet over. He wanted to push forward. He wanted to strike directly at the enemy's last center of power. He believed that American forces, with their superior speed and firepower, could take Berlin with far fewer casualties than the Soviet Red Army, because he knew that most German soldiers would rather surrender to the Americans than fall into Soviet hands. Yet at the very moment Patton felt closest to the pinnacle of his career, the door to Berlin began to close. Not because the Germans had stopped him, not because he lacked strength or momentum, but because the war had now moved beyond tactics and fully onto the political chessboard. And on that board, Patton's speed, audacity, and operational genius were no longer decisive factors. His final opportunity and his greatest dream was slipping from his grasp just as victory seemed to be firmly within reach. After dinner on the 12th of April 1945, at Patton's forward headquarters in Thuringia, Dwight D. Eisenhower formally informed Patton and Omar Bradley of the plan to end the war in Europe. The order was brief and unequivocal, leaving no room for debate. Anglo-American forces would halt at the Elbe River. There would be no drive on Berlin. Patton's Third Army would turn south into southern Germany and Czechoslovakia instead of continuing its thrust eastward. Berlin, the final apple of the war, would be left to the Soviet Red Army. Patton was stunned. He tried to persuade Eisenhower to reconsider, emphasizing that his forces were in a favorable position and that, if allowed to advance, he could reach Berlin before the Russians arrived. Eisenhower shook his head. This decision was not driven by tactics, but by politics. At the earlier Yalta Conference, Allied leaders had implicitly agreed that Berlin would fall within the Soviet occupation zone after the war. Eisenhower would not accept having American soldiers bleed to capture a city only to hand it over to Stalin. Moreover, Berlin still contained roughly 500,000 German troops prepared to fight to the end. A direct assault could cost tens of thousands of Allied lives in the final days of the war. For Eisenhower, who consistently prioritized ending the war as quickly as possible, with the lowest possible casualties, that price was unjustifiable. He believed that eliminating the remaining pockets of resistance in southern Germany and Austria mattered far more than a symbolic but high-risk victory. In Patton's eyes, this was excessive caution. In Eisenhower's eyes, it was the responsibility of a commander who carried the lives of the entire Allied armies on his shoulders. Patton understood the argument, but he could not accept it. Throughout his career, Patton had believed that speed and audacity were the decisive factors in war. And now, standing at the very edge of the finish line, he was forced to stop not by the enemy, but by a political chessboard that had been arranged long before he reached it. On the 2nd of May, 1945, the Soviet flag flew over the roof of the Reichstag. Berlin fell into the hands of the Red Army. At the same time, Patton, advancing through Czechoslovakia, received orders to halt on the outskirts of Prague, yielding the honor of liberating the capital to Soviet forces. The man who had driven his armies across Europe at unprecedented speed was now forced to stop before invisible lines drawn by politicians on a map. In his diary, Patton bitterly wrote that he felt like an outsider in his own victory. The war in Europe ended in contradiction. Patton was proud that America had won, yet he could not swallow the feeling of being shut out of the final decision. He believed that, if unleashed, he could have gone farther. He could have ended the war on his own terms, even confronted the Soviet Union directly in Berlin. But by the time the victory flags were raised, every opportunity had already slipped away. The battlefield had fallen silent, and for Patton, this was not merely the end of the war, but the moment he realized that in modern warfare, the one who wins the fastest is not always the one who gets to decide how it ends. After the war, George S. Patton did not return home in the glory of a victorious hero. He was assigned a role entirely unlike the battlefield he understood best: military governor of Bavaria, in southern occupied Germany. For Patton, this was not a reward but a forced redirection from commanding armies to managing politics, from high-speed warfare to the slow grind of post-war order. And as always, Patton did not change. He spoke bluntly, he spoke quickly, and he said things the system could not accept. Patton openly criticized the Allied policy of denazification, arguing that dismantling the entire existing administrative apparatus would paralyze Germany and open the door to the spread of communism. In his mind, the next enemy was no longer the defeated Nazi regime, but the Soviet Union, a far greater and more dangerous threat, advancing toward Europe day by day. Patton did not stop there. In press interviews and private conversations, he made shocking comparisons, describing the Nazi Party as a failed political organization, akin to political parties that had once existed in the United States. For an American public emerging from war, newly confronted with the reality of concentration camps and genocide, such statements were not merely errors, they were unforgivable. Public outrage erupted. The press turned against him. And for Eisenhower, who was struggling to preserve America's moral authority in the New World Order, Patton had crossed the final line. In October 1945, Eisenhower made a decisive decision. Patton was relieved of his command. No court-martial, no debate, no opportunity to explain himself. The man who had driven armies across Europe faster than any other general was removed from the machine by a single administrative order. Patton's career ended not in gunfire, but in silence. 2 months later, in December 1945, Patton died in Germany as a result of a car accident. His death came suddenly and quietly, almost incongruous with a life defined by constant motion. A man who had spent his entire life atop tank treads departed on a quiet post-war road as the world moved into a new order in which there was no longer a place for him. George S. Patton was a rare military genius, a commander who understood war as a current, where speed, audacity, and relentless pressure could break entire armies. To the Germans, he was a nightmare. To his own soldiers, he was both an inspiration and a source of fear. But Patton was also a personality that could not be domesticated. He said aloud what the system dared only to think. He acted faster than politics could adjust, and for that reason, he won repeatedly on the battlefield, yet lost in closed conference rooms where wars are decided not by tanks, but by agreements and balances of power. The lesson of Patton does not lie in whether he was right or wrong. It lies in the cold truth of modern warfare. Individual brilliance, no matter how extraordinary, cannot rise above a system designed to control it. Patton could smash enemy defenses, but he could not break the political boundaries erected by his own side. The war machine he commanded once crushed its way across Europe, yet in the end, it had to stop before something larger, the machine of politics, diplomacy, and the post-war world order. And that is the final paradox of George S. Patton, the fastest victor in Europe, who was never allowed to decide how the war would end.